started. Hello and welcome everyone, to those that are in-house, but also to those who are online. We are very pleased to co-host this May 2026 educational presentation with our friends from the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society. My name is Cindy Robichaud and I am part of the Kent Branch operating team. Also helping us is Colleen LeBay and Angela Churchill, who are also in-house. So thank you very much. Before we begin tonight, we want to express our thank you gratitude to the McKinley family and staff. This is their facility and it's a beautiful facility and they always are very generous with us. So all the technology that you see here, it comes with the facility and they're always so generous. With that being said, they also offer coffee and tea and water, which you can get up and help yourself to at any point in time. And then we're going to be having some snacks a little bit later on. So we are recording and streaming tonight, courtesy of the Bicentennial Branch of the United Empire Loyalists of Canada, who have graciously lent us this little gray device sitting on the table that's called Meeting Owl. And it is what is streaming and sending it to all the folks online. I do need to warn you though, it's very sensitive, so it'll pick up any chattering going on in the background. For the folks at home, you can ask questions of anybody here, our speaker, Josh, myself, by clicking on the chat box, and Angela is going to manage the chat. So go ahead and put your questions into your chat box. So then anyone joining us for the first time, and then I see a lot of new faces here, so that's great. Thank you for joining us. I want to tell you a little bit about Ontario Ancestors. We're also known as the Ontario Genealogical Society, and we are a nonprofit registered charity that's been around since 1961. And is the largest genealogical society in Canada, with a mission to encourage, bring together, and assist those interested in the pursuit of family history and also preserving Ontario's history. It's very important to us. So they have a great website, so be sure to browse the website for information on, services and things that might help you with your family history research. There's over 30 branches and special interest groups all across Ontario, and we are the Kent Branch. Our family history collection is located at the Chatham-Kent Public Library on the second floor. We are open on Friday and Saturday afternoon, 1 to 5 p.m. There's over 45 years worth of genealogical material and historical material there too. So if you've not visited us, please do so. At this time, I just want to mention a new book. Our volunteers are, I'll be right, can I leave and come back? I forgot to grab it. Two of our volunteers, Marianne Lucio and Julie McGurka, they are from the Merlin area and they are historians. They would have worked the last 2 years pulling together information on local schools. They were doing some research and they couldn't find a lot of information, so they made their mission to do that. And they did it on behalf of us. So they have donated their material, their resources. They've come up with this book. It's coming soon. Don't ask me the price because we don't know yet. It's at the printers right now. So basically it's the histories of all the Tilbury East schoolhouses. The next version will be the Raleigh side. So it's coming soon as well. There's a sign up sheet there. If you think you might be interested, just put your name and email and we'll contact you when it's ready to go and let you know when it's available and how much it's going to cost. Okay. We always like to connect with you as well. So you can email us. We have a really, really good Facebook group with over 1,000 people that are interested in family history and just general history. And then we have a website as well where you can register for these types of events. We have lots of material that we put up there for our members, but also for the public. Just a couple dates to save and think about. Our friends at the Bicentennial Branch, their next meeting is May 30th. They're having Bill Russell come in from, you said Nova Scotia? He'll be streaming in from Nova Scotia. All the details are on their website and how to register. You can register online, or they hold it at in Kingsville if you want to go as well. And then even though this is our last presentation until the fall, you might want to consider joining the Ontario Ancestors Annual Virtual Conference. From steamships to microchips. It's held on June 12th to the 14th, and you can register at that link. Okay, so now I'd like to invite Josh Reeves from the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society to tell us a bit about their group. And then he's going to introduce our guest speakers. So Josh.
Thank you, Cindy. Good evening, everyone. My name is Josh Reeves, and I'm the curator for the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society and Black Mecca Museum. I've been with the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society for about 4 months now, preserving and promoting some of the Black history of Chatham's community. So the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society itself has been around since 1994. And since their origin, the society has been working towards making sure the stories of the legends and trailblazers that came before us and paved our path are never forgotten. They're also the creators of the Black Mecca Museum, which is the culmination of artifacts, images, and stories inside the Wish Center, where people can go to learn about the amazing things that came of the Black people in this community and the hardships and the barriers that they faced. Whoops, that's hold it upside down. So yeah, that's us. We're at 177 King Street inside the Wish Center. We're open from 9 to 4 Mondays through Fridays. And in the spirit of honoring the past and promoting our history, we are once again holding our annual Field of Honor baseball event, September 19th from 11 to 4. It's a day to honor the 1934 Chatham Colored All-Stars, the all-black baseball team that was based out of Chatham, who defied the barriers of their time to become the first Black team in Canada to win a provincial title. So Field of Honor celebration is a day for the community to come together and for a day of baseball in honor of the 1934 Chatham Colored All-Stars. And as I mentioned, the event takes place right here at September 19th, 11 to 4. So anyone can go. It's a very good time. So enough about us. It's my honor to co-host this event with Cindy and the Ontario Ancestors Kent branch to introduce you all to Marie Carter. So Marie grew up in Dresden, literally next door to the Josiah Henson Museum, its original location, and has had a lifelong interest in Canada's multicultural history. Marie is a former member of the Uncle Tom's Cabin Community Advisory Board, researcher and writer for the Dawn Settlement Tour, community advisor with Diane French for the Dresden Cemetery relocation project, co-investigator on the Promised Land Project, a 5-year $1 million community university research alliance project, and the author of several books, the founder and administrator of the Dresden Virtual History Group, and founder and co-chair of the Dresden History Group Working Committee, which oversees the Dresden Archives and organizes historical tours. Mary has given numerous talks and presentations and has received several prestigious awards, including the Lieutenant Governor's Lifetime Achievement Award for Heritage in 2025. So please join me in welcoming Marie Carter.
Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to see such a good turnout tonight and to see some familiar faces and people who've heard me speak before. And welcome to all of you. And I feel especially happy to be here tonight because I'm getting to speak to two groups that have been with me through a lot of this journey. I think that the Ontario Genealogical Society, Frank Bink is sitting over here, and I think we've had many long conversations with Frank as we were developing this story that is now in the light of dawn. He's done a lot to help me with some of the genealogy down in Dover Township, and we had a really wonderful tour with him once, all the area down that way. But I think my relationship with OGS goes back even further when I was on the Uncle Tom's Cabin. Josiah Henson Museum, I think it was called the Uncle Tom's Cabin Community Advisory Board at the time, there were 3 people from OGS that were part of that committee. And you probably recognize some of the names, Ivy Busher and Pat and Bedford. And they're the ones that really gave me an appreciation of how important genealogy is. And I think that before that time, I thought it was just people looking for their families. But they really showed me how it is a very, serious branch of study of history. And certainly Cindy and all her crew now, when I have a little bit of a naughty problem in genealogy or local history that I can't solve or I don't have time to chase down, Cindy's and her crew have been just wonderful to me. And Chatham Kent Black Historical Society, back in the beginning, if it wasn't for the Black Historical Research Rooms and Glenn Robinson's work there, this book might never have come about because I wouldn't have been able to find some of the information anywhere else that came out of there. So I hope you think of this presentation tonight as a little bit of a thank you card to your 2 groups. And I hope that I can manage to say something new to those of you who heard me speak before on the book. Because it's been now over a year since launch at Josiah Henson Museum last year. And I've done about 8 of these talks now, so I'm trying to find something fresh that would be of interest to this. It's been the challenge. But I wanted to include in this talk tonight a little bit about the journey to into the light of dawn. Some of the steps that why I became a writer of history, because believe me, in the beginning, I did set out to become a historical writer. It was sort of an accidental sort of side trip, and Lorraine is sitting there smiling and nodding her head because she knows that most of my life was with the Social Justice Office of the Diocese of London, and she very graciously allowed me in my half-time job there to also work on some of the history work. But anyhow, I've been richly blessed in what I've been able to do with this. The journey for us really began, and my husband Jeff's at the back too, and I really do give all credit to the fact that one day he came home and he said, I just had this proposal. Some of the folks in town want to start a little project called the Trojan Trail Historical Walk. And yeah, says, I've got all my other work to do. Would you be interested in helping me out a bit? And I thought, oh, well, a little reading and a little something I can do on watching the kids, right? Well, 20 historical plaques, 8 interpretive panels, a trail guide, and a book later, in the space of a year, was the beginning of my interest in some of the lost stories of the dawn. Basically, the group that asked us to do this had developed the trail already, and as you can see here, this is the full-length trail, which joins Josiah Henson Museum with some of the recreational areas of Dresden in the parkland. When they were developing that trail, a number of the people that were working on it kept running into the footings of buildings. And they kept asking, like, what was this? Like, why do we have these different buildings here? Was there anything important here? Could we maybe make the trail more interesting by making it a historical walking trail for part of it at least? Considering that we're doing this part in part, and I'm sorry, it's the old name because it's an old map, but to hook up with the museum and try to get people familiar that there's other history here too. So they commissioned us and they said, can you find maybe 10 sites along the trail where we could put up plaques? And sure, we'll do a survey of the histories that already exist. And we came up with, how many was it, Jeff? Was it something like 40 or something that we came up with that we said would be possible to develop something? And they then asked us to whittle this down to 20. So that was the beginning, and to their good credit, they said, we don't want you to base what you write upon this on what's been written already. We would really like you to be able to verify the exact locations of where these businesses were. And we'd also like you to verify through the primary record that these are the real stories. And so that meant that this whole procedure began to be one that wasn't based on events or on particular people, it was land-based. And was based in primarily the land rights. And so we dug into some of the old surveys. And this area just also happens to be the area that encompasses the first two early surveys of Dresden. And this is survey 127 and 128, and this is Old Fairport. And of course, the British American Institute. See how much of a chunk of Dresden the British American Institute was. And then Henson's farm below that. It was also Davis's farm, and we can get into a bit of that later. But I just wanted to show you this map so you have an idea of what I'm talking about when I'm mentioning some of these surveys. But I also wanted you to see that compared to the other map you saw earlier, this one here, you can see it's the same area. So all this land was developed on these early surveys around that 1840 mark. That's when the British American Institute was founded in 1841. 127 was 1845. Fairport, similar age, and then 128 immediately followed. When we got looking into the records, we found a lot of the standard things and were able to verify a lot of the stories we already knew. But then one of the things that really jumped off the page for us was, particularly in survey 128, you see all these shaded lots. These were all owned by a succession of people with names like Dennis Hill, J.W. Purnell, Absalom Shadd, William Goodrich, William Whipper, J.B. Hollingsworth, all acting in partnership on ownership of these lands. The ones that are the speckled ones up there were all owned by two brothers, the Charity brothers, James and Cornelius. And as we got digging into who were these people, found out that these were all people of African descent. They were all Black people. And how startling, because they owned this not just briefly, but from about 1851 up into the 1870s. And what was really shocking about all that was that not one of these people are mentioned in any previous history of Dresden. We had never seen these names, didn't know who they were. There was only one line in Robert Brandon's History of Dresden that said, a colored man by the name of Whipple or Whipper owned some land along Main Street.
Sorry.
That's a great understatement. So anyhow, so then we started doing our genealogical research, cross-referencing the census, looking at wider histories, and in the history, we found that William Whipper was a man from Columbia, Pennsylvania. He was the principal Underground Railroad conductor and station master for the busiest crossing in the Free States, from the slave to the Free States. He was also the partner of Stephen Smith, who was in the leadership of the Black Convention movement, and himself a leader of the moral reform movement that believed if you could uplift the lives of people of African descent by introducing moral reforms that lifted up all of society. And a lot of his writings, if you read Whipper's early writings, really reflect this kind of idea of everybody together working to improve the state of people who were poor and disadvantaged. And he also believed in a cooperation between different racial groups, and he also believed in a peaceful approach to social change. So a lot of his writings would remind you of later writers like Martin Luther King, for instance, from his stance on nonviolence. He was also an educator, and he had political connections and financial means to make a difference. He owned rolling and paper stock in the Reading and Pennsylvania Railroad, coal and lumber mills, and considerable real estate. And in addition, he also was a moneylender and eventually a banker, and he had founded libraries and schools. And this is not the kind of history I was ever told about who were the people who came in that vast number of settlers, those 30,000 people who came north during that pre-Civil War time. I had never heard of anyone like this, and that he wasn't just one person, but there was this whole group of people very similar to him, not as wealthy as Whipper and his partner Smith, but certainly with the same kind of political connections, education and other advantages that made it possible for them to do things that we had never been told that people would have to be saying every time here. This now, when you talk about someone like Burger, you can't talk about, okay, this is someone at the area that we know as the Don Settlement, who was supposedly one of the people escaping slavery who came to settle here. This man is a settler, he's a land developer, and he's a developer of industry. In 1851, when he and his colleagues and family began buying up what eventually became 3/4 of the land mass of the original surveys of Dresden, he also established a warehouse, an inn, flour mill, a white pine lumber mill. The discovery of all this just frankly shocked me, and the only mention of the, as I said, had been this one week mentioned in the branding history. The only really celebrated African Canadian that we had heard about in our local histories, and that I was very familiar with from growing up next door to the camp, to the museum, was this man. Of course, doesn't need any introduction at this point. He's become very famous, and rightfully so. And his story placed the story of Black settlement in our area as being in this kind of realm of being singularly a story that linked 200 acres of property of the British American Institute to something called the Don Settlement. And all my life growing up, I believed that the Don Settlement was confined to those 200 acres of the BAI. And that on that 200 acres, it would have been roughly 500 people who settled. The accepted narrative of the Don Settlement portrayed it as a planned utopian settlement composed exclusively of escaped slaves who relied on educational and other supports at the BII, intended to credit most of the development of the BII to Henson. And said that, in fact, that Henson founded a community called Don. Now, from the outset, I'll say that Henson remains a giant of the 19th century Black history, an icon of Canadian Black history who is important to know about and recognized for his accomplishments. And much has been done in recent years by Stephen Buck, curator of the museum that now bears his name, and others to research and share just how remarkable this man truly was. For those of you who have not visited Josiah Henson Museum, I really recommend that you go. And I'd also recommend that you begin to look at some of the more modern scholarship on Henson, including this book, which came out about 3 months after, like Don did. It's written by a woman from Washington State in the US, and it's called My Name Is Not Tom, because of a statement that Henson had made when he was speaking in Scotland. He said, "My name is not Tom, never was. I do not wish to be known by any other name than my own." And so that really looks at the whole life of Josiah Henson, instead of confining it to his years in slavery and escape. So why did Henson become known as Uncle Tom? And that's because he was one of the people who inspired the title character Harry Beecher Stowe's landmark anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was subtitled Life Among the Lowland. And for this reason, of course, for many years, Henson was referred to as the real Uncle Tom, and anything associated with him had that attached to it. Because the novel had been so successful, Henson's story, and Henson was named it because Henson's, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit nervous up here and I'm sounding very nervous. Because the novel had been so successful, Henson's story, and Henson was named as Stowe's Key as one of the inspirations for the title character, linking his name with that of the fictional Uncle Tom, because that became a powerful promotional device during his speaking tours in England, and later for arguing the importance of preserving his final home in Dresden and in promotion of that site. Because in the beginning, when Henson was not so well known, people believed that if you named it Josiah Henson Museum, no one would come, but if you named it Tom's Cabin, people would have this association and be curious enough to come. Unfortunately, that had some very negative impacts as well. I like to show this, especially when I'm speaking to schools. Because I like to challenge the young people about where they get their ideas about things. And I would say that the stories we tell each other and the images that we project have very powerful impacts socially. How we view people, not only in the past, but how we view people now. As Jenny Johnson maintained in 1947, when she advocated for a museum named for Henson, if people had known Henson's real life accomplishments, perhaps they might have had greater regard for his descendants. I think that's a very profound statement. And I would submit that while the stories of the brave and resilient people, men, women, and children who escaped slavery and made the long journey to Canada need to be known and celebrated, that there is given evidence at Dresden a more complex and nuanced history that should also be understood. And I don't think we get along very well with complex and nuanced histories. We tend to like to have those histories that portray heroes and villains and simple stories. And I think when we do that, we really do a disservice to whole groups of people at times. And I would submit that some of the images we've used in the past have included this one, which has been very overused, I think. And I would say that for those of you who don't know, that at one time, this was literally a stereotype. That was the printer's term that they used for images that you used over and over again to represent a particular idea, but it didn't necessarily represent the actual person. So these kinds of images were used in the 19th century to portray the idea of someone who's escaping slavery, and they were used on handbills for retrieval of slaves and those types of things, and in newspaper articles. But also in the 20th century, because it was a public domain type of image, it got used again and again in illustrating Black history. And how many of us have been guilty of, when somebody mentions Black history, of this type of image popping in your head? And there are aspects of this that are true, but there are others that aren't. The majority of people who escaped from slavery were male. And they usually escaped with very little. And so and some did come through the bush, as Henson did on their travels, but that's not everybody's story. Not even for those who escaped slavery. Problem with Uncle Tom's Cabin as well is that it spurred this whole industry where people were actually selling cabin images to cash in on Uncle Tom's Cabin themes. And this image, when it was presented to me, when I first saw it, I thought, what on earth is this? Because this isn't life as I would have known any of my neighbors who have experienced it. And it was taken in about 1870 by a young white woman who was trying to make her name for herself as a photographer. And I think the really telling thing about this image is it's the only image of a Black-owned farm. And I would take that very lightly. That was among a whole series of images of farms that were white-owned, that were all pristine, looked wonderful and prosperous. So what was this? And I've had different experts look at the picture, and they almost wholeheartedly agree it's probably not their house. Can anybody kind of point out a couple of details that you can see that can tell you that maybe this isn't? And I would submit that we've got broken farm equipment. There's nothing farm with this. It looks like a cattle shed in the back. Fencing. I've had someone argue that these aren't all children from the same families. But this picture was actually presented to me as being Henson's actual family. And there's no way. So it shows you how, you know, this notion of images, how we have to be careful and have a very critical eye for the kinds of things that we accept as being images that portray people who are way of life. Anyhow, so when we started with the Trillium Trail, I really was an amateur at all this, and I really do thank Gwen for being so generous in the beginning with her help through the room, through the research room, because, she gave me a real education in many, many things. And helped me to put some of this in context, understand more about family names, relationships, those types of things that were really essential to know when we were looking at Dresden, because so many of those early landowners there were actually interrelated. They were either business partners or they were family. And people did tend to move in families or communities and take up residence pretty much as they had in their home communities. So those are very important kinds of things to understand. Then she also invited me on to be one of 12 co-investigators of the Promised Land project. And that was an extremely important step for the development of this history. That I began to feel very passionate about at this point, because I really felt that this kind of omission of information and misrepresentation of a whole group of people was really an injustice. And I really thought that something needed to be done to, put individuals back into the story and really tell the story with the kind of detail and respect that it deserved. The Promised Land was an opportunity to learn more about the national and international historical context of the Don settlement's time, and to have our discoveries at Dresden become part of an academic historical discourse, so that we can then begin to share these ideas of what happened at Dresden, this new research with other people beyond our own area. And to have research credited and published and distributed beyond the local area and through academic publishing houses. And this volume of The Promised Land was published, I'm sorry, I can't remember the year that this was now, I think it's something like 2005. But at that time, I was able to publish two papers in this, a group of others that all talked about the history of Chatham-Kent. And being able to discuss all this history with other historians from across North America, those 12 co-investigators included a lady from England, I think about a half dozen people from across the United States, and three or four people from across Canada. And to see some of this work included and discussed by these individuals and brought forward more in the philosophical kinds of arguments they were having about this was really important, I think, to helping me think broader about things like, for instance, we'll talk later about the intellectual migrations. Because it wasn't just a movement of people, it was also a movement of ideas. By the end of the Promised Land project too, I really begun to question this map, which is a survey map of the British American Institute. And you can see this is all neatly laid out with nice little lots and everything. And this has been presented for many years as being, a picture of what the Don settlement looked like. But as we dug further and further into the record, we found out that maybe only a dozen people lived on this property. That this was in fact surveyed at the end of the British American Institute's life, when they were about to sell it off. And so they needed to have it surveyed and put into lots so that it was more easy it was easier to sell to the people who wanted to buy it. And incidentally, when the BAI, I love this bit of the story. This one just for me, there were so many things that kind of got flipped on their head for me while I was doing this, about between what I'd always been told and brought up to believe and what had actually happened. And you know the old story of when the slaves escaped and they came to Canada, how they were the beneficiaries of so much good white largesse of we really let people in and helped them out to learn how to read and write and be good people and everything. What I found when we looked at these properties, and also a few of the Whippers properties incidentally, all of them were bought, almost all of them were bought by white people who later became some of the leading industrialists in Dresden. They were all bought with mortgages funded by the Wilberforce Institute. So this was a Black organization that was in charge of the BAI lands, that saw its transition from being the BAI into the Wilberforce Institute here in Chatham. And if they had not offered the mortgages, people would not have been able to buy this. So that just kind of completely flips that whole scenario on its head, because now you have people of African descent giving loans to white people. They gave them their start in their industrial careers. I love that story. Anyway, so what this told us about the whole piece that we've been investigating was that this whole idea of the Don's settlement was not, the way it was portrayed was also not very accurate, because if Don didn't exist on BAI, as we've always been told, it wasn't confined to this 300 acres of the BAI. Where was it? And so I started expanding the land record work I was doing, and we went through every lot again, but this time all of Camden Township, Camden Gore, Chatham Gore, and Frank helped out with some of the Dover pieces and others. And I started to try to map where black settlement was. So we cross-referenced the genealogies and the census information with the land records to discover which ones were in fact people of African descent. And then we came up with a map. That wasn't a map at all. There was no place on the map that you could really say, here is the Don settlement that was founded in this time and lasted this long. It was a much more fluid kind of piece of settlement. And it basically, doing all this work told us, and in fact, the Don settlement began 20 years before Henson even arrived. So the notion of Henson actually found in the Don settlement is a bit exaggerated, because Henson did have a very big hand in the BAI and other developments at Dresden, but he by far was not the first person to arrive. That was two families named Harris and Willoughby, who may have been there as early as 1800. And again, when we're finding out some of these dates, we're going, well, we're talking pre-organized Underground Railroad. So there has to be other stories besides the Underground Railroad story. And so, again, you can read about all this in the book, but this is the process by which I started to do the digging and started to begin to think about what is the real narrative here? What is the more complex narrative that tells us that we have here a settlement that is not, as the old narrative said, a Black utopian settlement. It was interspersed with Indigenous and with white people. And there were a great number of people who were of biracial and triracial identity. It was always said to be located on the terminus of the Underground Railroad, but in fact, what we found was a community that wasn't one where people came and stopped and that was the end of it. People were traveling back and forth, not only back to the United States, but to places like England. So we have a much more traveled, educated kind of population than what we expected to find. And we'd also always been told that all of Don fell under the management of the British American Institute. So everyone thought that all the mission work, all the educational work, all was under the British American Institute. But what we found as we dug was there were actually 14 missions at Don, in Dresden, based in Dresden, serving an area that went up into Lambton County, down as far as I'm sorry, the little town is escaping me right now, but south of Kentbridge into that area. So quite a large area that was being served. And so the idea of where's the border of Don became something very fluid, and something that also was not full blown in one time period, but it changed over time and changed over the course of as much as a century of what it looked like and where it lay. Does anybody have any questions on that? Because that's a lot of information. Yes.
One question, please. Mentioned that this settlement failed a couple times now. How did it fail and how was the area affected?
Okay, I would submit it didn't fail.
Okay.
This is part of this whole narrative of the law that's grown up over the years. But the idea that it failed was because people had always interpreted that the British American Institute had failed. And if you say that the British American Institute and the Don settlement are one and the same, it implies the Don settlement failed.
Thank you.
Besides doing that type of mapping, I also did a little bit of incremental mapping. And I was really fascinated by these maps for a while, but these are actually just 3 of the ones I did. I did one every 5 years. because of this idea that the settlement didn't stay the same. Really see it in Survey 127 a lot, where the original property that was bought, it's this one. And it was bought by a man by the name of Dennis Hill. And the research on this is still not complete. We still don't really know who Dennis Hill is. I'm in a very lively exchange right now with a man by the name of Roy Hopkins, who wrote a paper called Black Eldorado on Susquehanna. He's an expert on the community at Columbia where Whitburn was, and expert on Whitburn Smith. And he's in the process of reading all the Black Convention papers. And he's looking for me for Mr. Hill, and we're gonna try to figure out who he was. We know he arrived in Canada sometime around 1850. Don't know exactly when. We have one document that says he crossed back over into the United States in 1851, so we know he'd been here, and we think he was scouting for land. And anyhow, at Dresden, he first independently purchased this property. He would eventually become one of the larger landowners in Dresden. After he all kind of from 158. 158, you see that group of partners buying up all those lots together. But here, these are all individual landowners. So we have people like Isabella Goins. Isabella Goins eventually marries Peter Henson. But Isabella was herself when she came 18 years old, and she bought these two lots right here. And there were others as well. There are so many names, and you can, again, in the book, it's too much detail to go into here. But many of these lots were bought up by free people who came here, and we had money. And of course, the Baptist Church, Reverend Newman bought one of these lots. And some of these, again, were owned by Whitford and his brother-in-law and his sister, Mary Ann. And as you can see, the story has always been that after the Civil War, a number of people went home and the settlement ceased to be. But we can see clearly in these maps that even up into 1880, we still have some significant ownership in the main part of the town. And even after this, we have people who stay from this original group. They're still here in 1900. And so it kind of makes not only the idea of where the Don was much more expansive, but it also makes the idea of how long the Don lasted also expands that timeline. So back to that stereotypical image, and then let's look at someone who's actual settler. And I think that I show this not because this young woman, who we think is Ida Hollingsworth, the Williamsburg's granddaughter. It's not to say she's typical. I think there's a range of people between these two kinds of different images where we have female, a very cultured young woman, obviously has money, and the idea that we had that everyone was escaped slave. There's a whole range of people. And one of my biggest takeaway from all this research was the diversity of this community. It's incredibly diverse. And while that diversity is not just socially, economically, it's also culturally, it's also in terms of experiential consequence. So you have people who in their background were fur traders, they were transatlantic ships crewmen, they were lumbermen, they were soldiers, and a wide range of other professions. And they brought all that knowledge that they had learned in their previous life to Dresden and to other settlements in southwestern Ontario. The community also included writers and newspapermen like William Howard Day. And Dresden's first newspaper, in fact, in Dresden was founded by a man like Josephus Aubin. It was very short-lived. It was a one-page paper and it lasted about a year, but the fact remains it predates any of the other newspapers that were used. A black man was also Dresden's first doctor, and by the name of Dr. James Ray, later also practiced in Chatham. The first real estate agent was black, and his name was J.B. Hollingsworth. This is not the image you normally have of early life pioneers. The community not only had a number of businesses and industries developed by entrepreneurs like Whipper and Hollingsworth, but a rich cultural life with musicians like the Campbell family, who are pictured here. And some of you may be familiar with the Campbell family band, and may have even known Isom Campbell, who lived in Dresden. I remember Isom when I was a bit younger. And yeah, it was quite a long tradition of music in that family. There was also a lively debate of current events and issues happening. A variety of churches hosted traveling speakers. Parker T. Smith was once a member who was once the president of the prestigious Benneker Institute in Pennsylvania, moved to Dresden for a time and introduced a group at Reverend Thomas Hughes's Christ Church that promoted intellectual development through discussions and reading. And the Benneker Institute, for those of you who don't know, is connected to France. And it was an institute of people of African descent who were scientists and intellectual thinkers. And so that's a pretty amazing story just in itself. And there are also some wonderful women in the story. We have two women at Dresden, Marianne Whipper and Julia Shad. Now, Julia Shad is the daughter of Absalom Shad. This makes her a half. The genealogy messed up. Somebody help me if I stuck here. Absalom Shad and Abraham Shad are half. Marianne was Absalom's daughter, and I'm sorry, Marianne Shad, the newspaper woman, was Abraham's daughter. But this other lady that I'm talking about, Julia, she was the daughter of Absalom. The two of them were both friends back in Pennsylvania. And so Marianne Whipper, William's sister, and Julia Shad, while they were in Pennsylvania, were associated with a woman by the name of Lucretia Mott. I could see some recognition there. Lucretia Mott was one of the first people to campaign for universal suffrage. And so they were part of the early women's movement. This is not either of those women, by the way. This would be about another 20 years on from there. But I always love this picture. This is from Sandra Thompson's grandmother's photo album. And I was always struck by this wonderful 1890s, height of 1890s fashion here. She could be a Gibson girl, she's just a child. And it's not surprising then. I don't know if any of you recognize the church. If anybody does, you can shout it out. This is the Prince Albert Baptist Church when it was first built. And this lady right here is Jenny Johnson. And this is her congregation from Michigan. It was a white Baptist church in Michigan that ordained her. Any surprise that when you have this much intellectual thinking, missionary work, and women's kind of sense of self that existed in this community, that you would get Jenny Johnson as the first woman to become an ordained minister, black or white, in Canada. I think it's that tradition being passed on. So all these people were involved at dawn. And I think you might see some. This is of course Lucretia Mott. She actually traveled to Dresden. This is William Howard Day, the newspaper man from Ohio. This is Levi Coffin. He's also in Dresden in about 1845. Marianne Shad, who is very involved with the British American Institute and tried to form an alternative leadership group for that when it became very troubled. Benjamin Drew, one of the investigators that came. Osborne Perry Anderson, who we always associate as a printer for Marianne Shad. We actually found him in the Dresden land records as a farmer previous to his moving to Chatham. And this gentleman, John Brown. John Brown recruited people, not him directly, but John Brown's cause of the Harris Ferry insurrection. He recruited people from Dresden. And this is John Brown's son, John Brown Jr. John Brown Jr. spent 3 days in Dresden trying to recruit people for the Haitian immigration movement. This is something I've never heard of before, but Dresden has some really interesting connections to Haiti. This Absalom Shad and his mother were from Haiti. They moved away from Haiti after after the slave rebellion in Haiti, moved to Washington D.C. And because in Haiti, they had been part of a very privileged class in Haiti, they were able to establish, move their fortune into Washington D.C. Some of their group actually introduced ice cream to Dolly Madison's White House. As a lot of them knew haute cuisine and haute couture because they'd been exposed to French, the French court. And others, like the Shads, once they were in Washington D.C. and decided to move to Dresden, they sold what was one of the most prestigious restaurants very close to the White House. And the equivalent, I have it in the book about the equivalent today is something like a couple of $1 million they sold it for by today's money. And so that was some of the money I've invested in Dresden. But later on, interestingly enough, here we have John Brown Jr. who turns around and comes to Dresden when we have a number of people who become very disillusioned with the racism that is here in Canada. They thought they were escaping this when they came north. When they got here, they were having difficulties with the school systems and other things, and decided, we're done, we're going somewhere else. And Haiti, as the first Black republic, they thought that would be the place to go. And so John Brown Jr. took a number of people from Dresden down to Haiti, including William Newman, the minister who founded the First Regular Baptist Church. And unfortunately, there as well, their fortunes were not very rosy, and some of them died there, including Marianne Shad's brother-in-law. And a number of them moved on. One of them actually ended up in British Columbia, and that was one of the Charity brothers. So it was interesting when we started following these wonderful travel trajectories of some of these individuals, because a lot of these people are a lot more traveled than I am, and consider the times and how difficult it was to get around them. We have people going back and forth across the Atlantic, and we have one man who starts out in South America, moves to Washington, and then ends up in Dresden. I think he needed to follow the North Star. In addition to these people, we even had this man come to Dresden. Anybody know who this is?
Newspaper guy.
Frederick Douglass.
Yes,
The newspaper guy.
Frederick Douglass did a tour through Ontario, and one of his stops was at Dresden. It wasn't just a stop, he was invited directly to speak at the Emancipation Picnic of 1852. And he delivered a long speech and also published a two-part story on Dresden in his North Star newspaper. The advantagement Freeman settled here were the reason a lot of these people came. They knew there was money here and people here with political connections, the resources to be able to fund a lot of their causes back home. And so again, you get this idea that this isn't a terminus of the Underground Railroad. This is a crossroads. People are coming and going, and they're coming here not just to escape. They're coming here, they're going back and providing more back to their home areas again. And that continued, into the Civil War and long after, because there were a number of men from Dawn and also from most of the Chatham settlements that and spot as Civil War soldiers as well. So what happened to all that, you might ask? How did it suddenly just stop? And I would argue that it wasn't just a short-lived failed colony, but it was a vibrant settlement with a lasting legacy. And I'm seeing smiles. You know who this man is? Yeah. This is the president of the National Unity Association. I know we see Hugh Burnett really associated very strongly with the National Unity Association and all this. But I was really surprised when I was reading the town council notes in Dresden. This is a man that kind of started it. And I love this picture, which is from the Dresden Times, because he has a black chicken and a white chicken that he's going to bring to town council chambers. So they lay the same eggs. It's wonderful, Bill's humor, you know, and his ability to try to communicate complicated ideas in simple ways to people who didn't want to listen, and so he broke the ice with humor. But, it's actually another of our neighbors, actually. But anyway, I really do believe that, you know, when you look at the record and you see that Dennis Hill, that was the land person. Dennis Hill in 1851 launched the first challenge to the, to segregation in the common schools at Dresden. First time that was done as a legal lawsuit. And then you fast forward 100 years later, the grandchildren of that generation are challenging segregation still. And it tells me that there's a spirit that lingered. There are people who still have that really powerful sense that they could change society, that they could do things to change their own condition, but also to uplift other people. But this, I talk about this, I had to fight to get this piece in the book. Because they wanted me to stop at 1880, because that's the Don Sutherland story, and I said, no, you don't get it if you don't get this piece. And anyhow, I had to work on this idea, how working with peer reviewers and everything is really an interesting process, I'll tell you, and for various editors. But what I finally came up with was this phrase that it was a continuum of resistance and contribution that ran like a golden thread from one generation to the other. And I said, yes, that's it. And then we said, okay, go ahead, write the last half of the book. That continuum, I argued, came in all kinds of different ways. I love this picture. This is from Barb Carter's family home. She doesn't know who these individuals are anymore, but she told me that one of them is a Henson. And this is taken with the the Second Construction Battalion in Nova Scotia. And a lot of these men are likely from Dresden. There were quite a number from Dresden that joined that company. And their stories are all on the book as well. But this idea of service also extended, and contribution also extended to arming. And even when people were not allowed to join, or were barred from joining, or there was resistance to them being part of the same companies, or they were not allowed to be part of combat companies, they still showed up and served. And that started with Henson in the rebellion of 1838. And it ran through his entire family, certainly, but many other families at Dresden who served in the Civil War, and then World War I, World War II, and Korean conflict. And I think that's an amazing bit of courage just to keep showing up to serve even when you're meeting such resistance. And I think Don's heritage continues still, even to this day, to attract national and international figures, just as it did 100 years ago, or 150 years ago. You don't know that lady down there, but that's, this is Lawrence Gill, who was here. I had the pleasure of touring Lawrence in Dresden. We sat on the front steps of Hughes's Christ Church for a little bit and had a chat. And that was wonderful. But we also had John Diefenbaker here. Louis like Saint Laurent. This is actually a little girl from Dresden. I'm sorry the name escapes me right now, but he came during the National Unity Association crisis and made his point to sit in this damn lady.
Doris Roberts, the girl.
We've had people like Lincoln Alexander, and that's Rosa Parks over there. She was in Dresden twice. And I was really surprised because when I went to go and find out newspaper stories on her, it was really difficult to find she even here. When I read the particular account of her first visit to Dresden, I couldn't even tell whether she had been here or not, or whether she'd received this award in absence, because her name was buried somewhere in the end of the story. But in fact, she was here, sat next to Barb. This is Barb Carter, but at the time, this is her second visit here when she came to see Barb. But prior to this, she had sat on a podium next to Barb Carter's mom at a rally for civil rights that attracted 2,000 people to the Dresden Raceway. And I think it's a bit of recent history that a lot of us don't even remember. And that's when I was in high school.
Wow.
So, and of course, Stuart McLean was here. I don't know if you know him from CBC Radio. interesting gentleman to talk to, but he also wrote a chapter on Dresden in his book Welcome Home. So there's been this continued interest in it today. So anyway, that's, it would be impossible in the space of this short presentation to unpack the entire 200-year continuum of history, but I tried to represent in the book and all the ideas and some of the detail of the actual research. And I've not really tried to. I try to give you a little bit of a taste of what's in there, of where this journey is taking me over the last 25 years. But I hope I piqued your interest a bit, and maybe even encourage some of you to do some of your own digging into those primary records to find out what else was missing. Because I thoroughly believe in a lot of other communities that, like Dawn, is not an exception in this way. And I think that I know Chatham does have some amazing stories. Thanks to going digging through some of those, but I know you're probably continuing to research some of that. And I hope there's so much to learn. And I'm sure that in every of these communities there are these people who, have, as Stephen Hill says, phantoms in their history. They just don't show up, but they're there. It can really be difficult too. I think that one of my major takeaways from this is it can be really difficult to change the prevailing narrative. And after 25 years, I still get a little tired when I say I'm a historian and I look at the Dawn's home and I said, "Oh, you tell me all about Josiah Henson." And I said, "Yeah, I can do that, but I can tell you another story too, and it's just as fascinating." I think there's always, though, in all of this digging, I think it's extremely important, not just, again, as Jenny Johnson said, not because of the past so much as how we view people in the present. And I think a lot of this challenged how I saw my news. And I think that I have a new appreciation for the contributions of so many more people and a curiosity about so many more people of what was your part of the story, whether you were Indigenous and wherever you came from. I think we should all have a curiosity about each other's migration stories. And I think those migration stories in the end are really what binds us as Canadians. Because when I started out with this, it wasn't just that I was curious about this history, I was curious about something else, and that was Canadian identity. Because all my life, I was a hyphenated Canadian, and I didn't understand what that meant. Like either I was a Canadian or I wasn't. Or like my dad used to say, he was a $10 Canadian, because that's how much citizenship papers cost. But I think migration is one of the things that is a very common narrative within our backgrounds. And I think if we can begin to look for the common narratives and embrace the idea that we have been multicultural from the earliest times, that we can begin to grapple with this whole idea of what is multiculturalism in today. And for me, like I say, it can be a little journey of self-discovery as well. Anyway, thank you.
Any other questions?
I certainly hope there are questions.
I got a question.
Yes.
I mean, this is not my major question, but it's just a curiosity because when I was a little girl, I grew up learning to understand from Quakers, from reading. And I'm just wondering, some of these people you mentioned from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, were there any Quakers in that group?
I am. I'm chasing Quakers down right now. It's my latest fascination. I didn't want to start there because we have so much on Quakers and talking about all that. But especially in the States and her books are in the Quakers. Here, not so much, and that's what I'm very curious about. What happened to the Quaker connection here? Because at Dresden, there's Frederick Saber, who is one of the founders of Norwich in down in Oxford. And he was extremely involved not only at Dawn but also at Wilberforce. And I'm wondering what's the connection? Why are the Quakers purchasing land for by settlers in both of those areas? And Jake's the man who put up the money for the Dawn's British American Institute, also He was from Schenectady, New York, never moved to Schenectady. But he was a British Quaker who moved in New York and was involved with, Reverend Hiram Wilson's canonization. Yeah. So I think there's a lot more to that story and I'm where it's led me to go already. So, like conversation with the folks at the Norwich exams, and they're finding the same thing that I am, that the majority of the people were black landowners in that area were freemen before they came. So you have this whole population of freemen there as well. So I think you don't understand enough yet about that whole migration that happened after the passage of the Strategic Slave Act, when we had people coming north because they're no longer safe in the housing luxury. And I think it's shaped this area a lot with their investment in their development and their good intellectual ideas they got.
Sorry, I don't even know what the correct word is for, the slave owners who came looking to take back their slaves,
Yes.
right? Did they make it as far as Dresden or were any of them?
I didn't run into any stories of Dresden and Josh can probably, you still have the exhibit at, Chattanooga Black Historical Society that talks about the Vigilance Committee there, I'm sure. Where they snatched the one young man off the train as a slave at UZ. Yeah, so yeah, they did make it up this way, but I think one of the advantages, one of the reasons Berger may have chosen Dresden over Chatham, because he was in both places. His nephew, as a matter of fact, had a lumberman, the J.W. Canal that buys all his property at Dresden was also at Chatham, the lumberman that his uncle William was involved in. Yeah, there's all these connections between the communities, and I talk a little bit about that in the book as well. Where you have this interconnection, not only back to Pennsylvania and Virginia and Ohio, but you also have these connections between the different communities. So you have the Shads at Lexington, but you also have them at Dresden. There's a lot of interchange of ideas and resources between the different communities and a lot of social and neighborhood relations, which just only increased over time. And and migrations together that end up in Chicago and Dakota and Wisconsin and all kinds of places.
Any other questions?
You can ask me questions about the whole publishing process too, if that's of interest to you. It's been a bit of a journey. It took about 2 years to get this from the manuscript to the finished product. So it was I was struggling on itself. But I'm very grateful to Dr. Phil Cooper, when she saw the manuscript just immediately said, send me. She really wanted to see something done on and have edited one of my papers for the Promising Project, so was really approved.
Angela, are there any questions online? No? Okay.
My goodness, you're not very curious. Yes, Sue.
Just a comment regarding the Quakers. I think it was my 5th great grandmother was enslaved by a Quaker in Pennsylvania. And I believe it was about 1770, the Quakers issued a decree that they had to divest themselves of any slaves or they would be excommunicated.
Yes.
And she was enslaved by a man named Grono. And she was freed along with her sons in the will. And I think the sons, they had to be 25 when they were manumitted. And her descendants prospered. One became a master miller in eastern Pennsylvania. One went to New York State and he prospered there. His children were very much involved in the Civil War, the American Missionary Association. And my great grandfather immigrated and he settled in Dover Center. And he was there about, I think he was in the census in 1854. And he was located right where Bedell's Frozen Food is now. And he had a couple of 100 acres there. And he had a livery stable and a blacksmith shop. And the Dover Township people, they could leave their horses at his livery stable. And then they would commute on a train between Chatham and Wellsford. And then, my grandfather moved to Chatham Township on the 11th concession. I would say about 1912, something in that area, and they were there for quite some time, and later my dad moved closer to Dresden, actually at the corner of the Union Line and Baseline Road, right around the corner from you, where you grew up. And my nephew still lives on that property,
Yes.
and it was my mother's, was on the Lucas side of the family anyway. They settled there probably about 1850, and it's been continuously in the family since then.
Yeah, this is not unusual to find 7, 8 generations, same place. Yeah, it's amazing. And in the work that went into clearing that land, of developing it, I think it's one of the things we don't think about a lot. We think about development as being an urban phenomenon, but we forget about how much effort it took to do that rural development. So, well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. That was very interesting, and I think we all have a lot to think about and to consider. Josh, I don't know if you want to come up as well. But make sure you come and visit us, make sure you come visit Josh, take a look at Marie's book, visit the Dresden Historical Society, there are the archives, right? There's groups all around that have a little niche for that community, and it's well worth going for a visit and supporting that. That's what we like to do, is try to support the other local groups. So thank you very much for coming. No.
Okay,
Thank
folks.
you. Turn around. Turn around.
I have to wait for a minute because my friend here got.
So help yourself, there's snacks.
And if anyone wants to look, we can have them here.
Yeah.
Was that?
Okay.
Thank
Thank you. There's coffee, there's tea, there's snacks. So help yourself. Feel free to visit. You don't have to take it out.
The next.
So go a few more places.